Hello, everybody. This is the 5th episode of Comic DNA, and this episode we are going to be talking about Weapon X by Barry Windsor-Smith. Barry Windsor-Smith wrote, illustrated, colored, co-lettered. He dang near did everything involved in this comic all by himself. He's a true comics master if there ever was one. This comic was first published in Marvel Comics Presents, issues number 72 through 84. It was originally serialized as a 12-part series. Each chapter, I think, it's like 8 pages, something to that effect. So it's essentially just like a 12-chapter story. And that was back in 1991. So we are really excited to talk about Weapon X, but we are also really excited because we have a special guest on this episode. Now, of course, I am talking. My name is Aaron Walther, and I am the regular guy that you normally hear talking about comics. And with me today also is Luke Thompson-Moritz, the other
regular guy, yeah.
And we also have, as I previously mentioned, a special guest, my good friend, Alex Harner. Alex, say hello.
Hello. Greetings.
Alex is a very accomplished artist and a longtime friend of mine, and we have spent countless hours pointlessly talking about X-Men.
Most of our lives, actually.
Most of our lives, we've talked about this. And as I mentioned, Alex is a really talented artist. He actually did the original character designs for my comic, Zero's Heroes, which are printed in the Volume 1 trade paperback that I put together. You can find that on the website. The sketch designs are not, I don't think they're included on the website if you're reading it on the webcomic, but if you download the digital comic version of it, of the trade paperback, they're all in there. So just a little bit of Alex's foray into comic art, and hopefully we'll get him to do some more at some point.
Fingers crossed.
So anyway, let's talk about Weapon X. Weapon X is an X-Men comic, ostensibly, sort of like on the fringe of the X-Men universe. It's a Wolverine story, and it sets itself up to be the origin of Wolverine. At least the origin and how he became the adamantium-laced mutant. So it's interesting because it was first published in 1991, which is kind of the height of Wolverine fever.
Wolverine mania, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the X-Men had slowly been becoming Marvel's most famous and profitable comic series throughout the 80s, and Wolverine, through that, had also slowly kind of been becoming their most popular character. He was eclipsing their previous popular characters like Captain America and Thor. I mean, when you think about like the comics landscape in the 90s, it's really all about the X-Men and Spider-Man. Spider-Man was huge too, but the Avengers really took a back seat. And the other thing that makes this book really special is, as I said, it's illustrated and written by Barry Windsor-Smith, who is an interesting figure in the comics industry. Barry got his start working for Marvel Comics when he was 19 years old. He went to Marvel Comics looking for a job, and they gave him a job drawing X-Men number 53. It was the first thing that I ever drew for Marvel Comics, and that was in 1969, I believe. So he's always kind of had this history with the X-Men. He hasn't done a lot of work for the X-Men, but he keeps coming in and out. Barry Windsor-Smith is he's got a reputation as a guy that I guess can be hard to work with. He kind of came up in a time when a lot of artists were seeing the exploitation of Jack Kirby and other Golden Age artists, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction with that. And so he had a pretty public falling out with pretty much every publisher that he's worked with, and I think it's really unfortunate because I think he's one of the best comics draftsmen ever. And I think that his style that he developed as he worked through Marvel Comics really kind of became a modern masterpiece. Like it became the template that I think a lot of modern comics art, especially at that time, was measured by. As I said, he did a few. He kind of bounced around on different projects. He had left the comic book industry a few times and then kind of came back in. I just want to mention one little trivia question about Barry Windsor-Smith. One of the earlier comics that he drew was Avengers number 66 and 67, and that was the first appearance of Adamantium.
Whoa.
Yeah, and
I did not know that.
so it's sort of ironic that he would kind of go on to become the guy who
created adamantium, essentially.
He didn't create Adamantium, but he went on to become the guy that wrote the story that the thing that everybody knows Adamantium from, which is Wolverine's claws.
Because it's essentially like it's a household object now. Like everyone's like, oh yeah, adamantium. It's as hard as adamantium. Yada blah blah blah.
It gets mentioned all the time in geek circles. Not even in the context of X-Men.
Yeah, it's just a thing.
Do you think it's the world's best known fantasy metal, or do you think Mithril beats it out? I don't know.
Ooh, that's really tough.
That's tough because of the X-Men movies.
Yeah.
I might be willing to give it to Adamantium now.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time when Mithril would have been it.
Don't forget about unobtainium.
Yeah,
Oh,
unobtainium. Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about that.
That's a good answer.
So anyway,
I really only noticed his reading Weapon X, and the old Claremont issue where Wolverine fights the Reavers in New York, I think.
Yes.
Barry Windsor-Smith really is responsible for that kind of that iconic Wolverine looking all bloodied up and things sticking in him.
I was going to mention that that's issue, what is that, 205? That might be one of my favorite X-Men issues ever, or definitely one of my favorite Wolverine comics ever as a single issue. And we almost should have read that one for the podcast, but we're not. We're reading Weapon X. But yeah, the Claremont Windsor-Smith story is really good. And like you said, Wolverine just kind of like that tough last man standing, bloodied up.
There's a lot of particles. His hair is all crazy. Mm-hmm. There's usually snow.
I think there's a lot of that. I think Windsor, I would have to do more extensive research than I'm not going to do, but I think Windsor-Smith is kind of responsible for the big hair Wolverine.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad that I could thank him for that. I love that. I think
somebody
great.
had to do it.
Yeah.
I think that the big hair Wolverine really kind of became a thing, definitely after Weapon X, because the way Wolverine's presented in this book as Weapon X, like the naked with the big helmet and the wires all over his body, that kind of became one of the iconic versions of Wolverine. You have the yellow costume, you have the brown costume, and you have like the variations on that, and you have the Weapon X.
Right.
And I'm sure there are some others that I can't think of because there's been 1.5 million depictions of Wolverine.
On an interesting side note, in the Marvel vs. Capcom video game series, the newest iteration, the third one, Wolverine has the Weapon X costume in it with the helmet and the wires dripping off and stuff. So it's pretty iconic.
Yeah, like I said, it's one of the versions of Wolverine.
Yeah.
I mean, they made lots of toys based on. I've got one of them somewhere.
What a nerd.
Yeah, I like Wolverine. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Weapon X. Now, I have to admit, I can't really be too unbiased when I talk about how great this comic is because it was one of the first Wolverine comics that I ever read. Not the first. I don't remember what the first one was specifically, but I have a very specific memory from this comic. This would have been in 94, maybe 93, back when they first collected this story into a trade paperback. I was able to buy the first trade paperback through it was some mail order store service that they had in their comics. I can't even remember it.
In the age before the internet.
Exactly.
Getting like the money order and getting those sent to your house.
Yeah, it was a totally different time period, but I was able to convince my parents to let me spend I forget. I bought a lot of comics. Like I remember the day when I got like this big box of comics and I was so excited because it was all like collected stuff or old stuff. And this was like the prize. I really wanted this book, Weapon X, because I really liked Wolverine. He was a cool character, even though as a 12, 13-year-old kid, I didn't really understand, a lot of it, but it spoke to me on a very visceral level. And I have this very specific memory. I was reading this book as a sheltered middle class white 13-year-old kid.
Sounds about right.
And I was just blown away by just the starkness of it all, like the violence, and there's blood everywhere.
Yeah.
I have this very vivid memory. It was the middle of the afternoon, and I was lying in bed reading this book, and my dad comes into my room, and I very hastily put the book down and try to cover it up under the blankets because I'm afraid that I'm going to get in trouble for reading this bloody, violent book. And my dad, of course, is not an idiot. He saw what was going on, and he was like, what you got there? And I'm sure my dad was probably more concerned that it was something a lot worse, like pornography or something like that. But I kind of like reluctantly showed it to him, and he kind of flipped through it, and he was like, oh, it's a comic book? And and he's like, well, why were we trying to hide it? And I said, oh, it looks like it's kind of violent. And he goes, yeah, well, and that was pretty much the end of it. Like, he just kind of like left it at that. But
Dad's gonna be dads.
That's gonna be dads. But I specifically remember as a kid reading, like, this book opened my eyes and blew my mind. Just because it wasn't so, like, it was different than other comic books. It didn't feel like it was, it felt like it was trying to break out of what comics are. Similar to the way, like, Alan Moore and Frank Miller stuff did with their Watchmen and Batman.
I can definitely see some of that influence.
Yeah, and this was a time period where you had a lot of these artists and writers in the comic book industry who were really fed up with the way the industry was going. As I said before, there was a lot of guys who were fed up with the way artists and creators were treated, and they were upset with the whole comics are for kids mentality. So there was this huge, like, burst of creativity in the late 80s, early 90s, right before the big bubble burst on the collector's speculation market. And, Marvel and DC were putting out books like this, books that were obviously different from just like the regular comics. And this was one of them. And this, like I said, this one really kind of like stood out to me as I recognized that this was different than just like the average Spider-Man comic written by, Tom DeFalco and, drawn Mark Bagley or whatever. Not that I dislike those comics. I like those comics a lot. But I'm just saying you can read this and you can tell that this is a comic that's trying to appease and appeal on a different level. So this was a comic that kind of shaped my worldview on what comics are and what comics can be. Now, as I understand it, Luke and Alex, neither of you have read this one before.
That's right.
Correct.
And Alex, I'm a little disappointed in you for that because,
I know.
As my expected for me.
Yeah, I expected from Luke. It's okay. Luke's a baby.
That's right.
But Alex, we've been talking about X-Men comics for a long time, and
I know. Wait, it's funny. As much as I love the X-Men, the bulk of my X-Men knowledge comes from when I was a kid, which, again, 1992, 93, 94, which there was a lot happening with the X-Men there, with the cartoon and a lot of the series being relaunched and whatnot. But it wasn't necessarily the most foundational time for X-Men comics. It was
That's correct.
Nor was it the necessarily the best X-Men comics being produced, but they're the ones that I know the best because I read a ton of them as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
But I missed this one, which is kind of weird. I
don't know how that happened. It was part of the regular series,
right?
And like I said, this was at a time when Marvel was really, really just trying to capitalize on Wolverine. So they had the two X-Men books. You had X-Men and Uncanny X-Men, and Chris Claremont was really adamant about not overusing characters. He didn't want. If Wolverine was going to appear in a book one month, he wrote a reason for why he wasn't in the other book because he had it all really tightly orchestrated about how the characters moved throughout the universe. So in 1988, they launched the Wolverine solo series, which Claremont also wrote, and that was a huge success. So you had two X-Men books and the Wolverine book. And then I think in '88 they also launched Marvel Comics Presents, which was essentially like a third, like almost a Wolverine book, because it was an anthology series, but each issue had a Wolverine story in it. That was the mandate. So each issue had a short serialized Wolverine story, and Weapon X kind of came out of that. There's a lot of other Wolverine stories. One of my favorites is the one that Sam Keith did with the first introduction of Cyber.
Okay.
I forget who wrote that one. Peter David, maybe. I think it was Peter David and Sam Keith, and they did a pretty cool Wolverine comic with Cyber. But yeah, so like this kind of came out of that, like the fringes of the X-Men universe of just Marvel's just wanting to put out lots of Wolverine stuff. And it's when that happens, you don't always get a lot of great material, but occasionally that gives room for somebody like Barry Windsor-Smith, who, as I think I mentioned earlier, notably is hard to work with on editors, often kind of clashes with them over little details. So from the impression I get on this book was, since Wolverine is just the cash cow and they're putting out so much Wolverine stuff, they basically just let him kind of have his way on this book. And as a result of that, he churned out a true masterpiece that is unlike any other Wolverine story.
So do you know, in terms of editorial involvement, and maybe we get to this a little bit later, but I was kind of intrigued by the amount. It was revealing, the secret history, right? Which everyone eats that up.
Yes, and this was one of the first comics to do that. Really kind of they'd been playing that off with Wolverine since his introduction to the X-Men.
This was very in-depth.
This was the first one where they had been playing up Wolverine's mysterious past, and then they were like, "Here's a part of it. Like this is the definitive. This is his mysterious past." Right. And obviously, Marvel has gone back to that well many, many times since then. But this was the first one to really.
Well, it's interesting because as straightforward and sort of pure a story as it is, there are a few openings that were sort of left there that Marvel definitely came back to, and I feel like I wonder, because I don't know. That was on purpose, yeah.
I specifically, I should have dug it out for this podcast, and I didn't. There was an issue of Wizard magazine published in maybe '95 that was a Wolverine special. They published it right after the Wolverine number 75, where all the adamantium got ripped out, and that's when they revealed he had the bone claws. And so Wizard, also being a sensible business, was capitalizing as much as they could off the popularity of Wolverine. And so they put out this Wolverine special, and it just had lots of history of Wolverine and interviews with some creators. And I specifically remember there was an interview, I'm pretty sure it was with Barry Windsor-Smith, talking about Weapon X and how he specifically left a lot of things open, like the main character basically in this is the professor who's in charge of the Experiment X, and he keeps going off and talking to a mysterious voice that is really the person in charge. And Barry Windsor-Smith specifically said he just left that open so that Marvel could do whatever they wanted with their continuity, because
that's very clever. That's smart of him to leave it open like that.
Yeah. At the time, I believe he said at the time the consensus is that it would have been Apocalypse.
Oh boy.
Because Chris Claremont wanted to use Apocalypse as basically for everything. Okay. And so this would have been the whole, like, following through on the survival of the fittest. Apocalypse knew Wolverine was a mutant, and so he was going to have him turned into Weapon X to be like the ultimate mutant. Would have been a sensible story arc. Good motivations for Apocalypse. I'm not going to speak on what they eventually did do with that plot point, because I don't. I haven't read into that. I'll just put it like that. I haven't read a lot of what they've done recently, but
I wonder why.
So it's interesting. I haven't read everything. There's a lot I don't know in terms of little bits of continuity, especially lately. But
yeah.
When Wolverine got his adamantium back in the late 90s, I think, it was Apocalypse. So in some way they managed to pull that back in there. Whether they planned it all along is debatable. But
right.
I don't know.
But yeah, so
who can say?
So yeah, who can say? So Luke and Alex, Luke, why don't you go first? Give me just kind of your first impression of this comic. Just ignore all the great things I've been gushing on about, and just
not a problem. So initially we've talked about this at work numerous times about how this is like the definitive Wolverine story. This is so great, so on and so forth. Yeah, I like Wolverine enough, as much as anyone does, like for the most part, but I didn't know much about him so I was excited to read this initially. You gave me the book to read, and first thing I noticed, the cover is very violent looking, very graphic. Yeah. He's tearing through all these soldiers.
It's got that picture of him standing on like a pile of dead bodies of soldiers.
And he's got the really long he's got the really long feral hair. And my first impression is awesome. I really love feral Wolverine. I think it's great. That's part of why I like Sabretooth so much, is because he is kind of feral and, whatever. So I get into this book, and, it starts off with the whole, it's showing sporadic images of him in the testing and whatnot. And I'm like, okay, I'm interested. I want to know what's happening. And then it just hits you full force, and oh my God, this book is so good. Oh my God, this book is so good. This is exactly what when I talk about Wolverine, and everyone's got their own opinion of him. Oh, Hugh Jackman. Oh, so on and so forth. Mm. This is what I pictured Wolverine as forever, even before knowing what this book was. Mm-hmm. I expected him as this, not necessarily mindless, but he's mad. He has a right to be mad. They kidnapped him. They experimented on him without his consent, so on and so forth. And I don't think what they've done with Wolverine since this book has been necessarily right. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say that, but
I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say that anything that they do is wrong, because whatever they do is whatever they do. But I don't think that. I think the character of Wolverine as presented in this book is very kind of specific to its time period, and it's really hard to kind of recapture that feeling of what Wolverine represented in 1991 and what he represents now.
Right. Mm. Okay. Yeah. I think part of it too is I'm like, I don't know, this book kind of like jaded everything else for me, because it's so stellar, and like I was saying, this is exactly what I pictured Wolverine as. This, So my first impressions were, this is everything I've ever wanted in a Wolverine story, more or less.
So, Alex, as somebody who,
it's worth noting too that I didn't really have much X-Men history prior to this either.
Exactly. Yeah. Other than like the movies and games.
The movies, cartoon, the other forms of media. I just recently started getting heavily into comics with this podcast, and a little bit beforehand. So, that's my viewpoint.
So, Alex, as a X-Men fan who's pretty familiar with a lot of the lore, how did you think Weapon X fit into, or what were your first impressions of the book, first of all?
Lots of impressions. I think the first thing that sort of stood out to me, apart from Barry Windsor-Smith being an awesome artist, was just the grittiness of it.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Frank Miller and Alan Moore before, but it definitely feels, it has that like 80s, maybe sort of early 90s gritty sci-fi quality, where things just seem messy. How he shades with all the sketchy marks, but then how he draws grizzle and gore, and how he shows things like the machinery sticking into Wolverine and everything else. It just feels very much stylistically, it's just not something that you see in that way anymore.
Well, it's That's true. First of all, I think we should be clear. This is definitely not a superhero comic.
No, not at all.
But it's also like that's kind of what I was saying earlier. Like it is it's a style of comics that you, like you said, you don't really see much anymore. And I actually think you could almost say that Barry Windsor-Smith, first of all, this was the last like major comics work that he did for Marvel. This was the last comics work that he did for Marvel, and I think you could argue that it was his last major comics work that he ever did. Which in 1991, I mean, goodness, how long ago was that? He hasn't done anything since like 2000 in like 15 years. So Barry Windsor-Smith is effectively retired from the industry. We all hope he eventually comes back, but that's whatever. That's neither here nor there. So I do think that if you consider the time period, 1991, this was, as I said, this was the height of all of these creators kind of really stretching out of the box, and this is when everybody started pushing the limits of the Comics Code Authority. The Comics Code Authority was eventually abandoned in like 2001, but really in 1991, everybody at this point thought it was a joke, and they weren't really adhering to it.
Yeah.
And so you had a couple of comics like these, which would just get away with, nuts to the Comics Code Authority. We're just going to do it anyway. And after this point, I mean, 1991 is like the year. Basically, the Marvel Comics especially, and as a result, the rest of the comic industry went on this decline throughout all of the 90s. The speculator boom completely bust. So all the money left the industry. All the people that were buying up multiple copies of #1 issues. Suddenly, that was no longer profitable anymore because everybody became hip to the scam. And Marvel Comics eventually went bankrupt, and they had to completely reinvent themselves to like 2000. And it's actually kind of impressive how they came back from that, because I do think that they were a better company for it. But there is I think this is kind of like the last work that represents almost like a classicist. I don't know what I'm trying to say. This specific style of comic book art, which is no longer really represented in mainstream comics anymore. Because when Marvel reinvented themselves, they reinvented themselves in the style of the then modern British comic book writers and artists doing what are called widescreen comics. And when you read Weapon X, if you're used to reading a lot of modern comics, all the stuff that Marvel and DC do today are all just byproducts of what like Warren Ellis was doing in Authority, and what guys like Garth Ennis and Mark Miller and Grant Morrison were doing. Everything that DC and Marvel Comics does now is a byproduct of that. Barry Windsor-Smith, the comics that he was doing in Weapon X, I feel it's a byproduct. It's the last of the Jack Kirby era.
Huh, interesting.
Because basically Jack Kirby created Marvel Comics, the house style. He became like the go-to guy to imitate. So you had every artist that started working for Marvel Comics, including Barry Windsor-Smith when he was 19 years old in 1969, was doing Jack Kirby impersonations. So you look at Barry's early stuff, and I don't necessarily want to say crude, but it's obviously a Jack Kirby imitation that's not as good as Jack Kirby. And you had guys that were working from that. They were working off Jack Kirby. Jim Steranko, Neil Adams, John Byrne, Dave Cockrum, all these guys. They started at Marvel, and they were basically just hired because they were similar to Jack Kirby. But as they kept going, and as they kept getting more popular, they started branching out in their own direction. But they still were very much the house style of Jack Kirby, or in just in how they presented their comics. And then in the 90s, that became completely uncool. Basically, is how it goes. You had Jim Lee and you had the Image boom, Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, and so those guys kind of came in, and they were still kind of. I think there was still a lot of influence from the Jack Kirby style, but it was more or less like they were influenced by the guys that were influenced by Jack Kirby, So it was this evolving nature of comics. But as I was saying, in the 2000s, that's when the widescreen comics, when you had John Cassaday and
Brian Hitch,
Steve Dillon, these guys, which are making very specific types of comics that are deliberately different than the Jack Kirby style in terms of how the comics are presented. Big boxes for panels, big widescreen panels. As opposed to when you read something like Weapon X, Barry Windsor-Smith uses a lot of thin panels, a lot of like vertical panels.
I just noticed that flipping to a random page in the book.
Yeah. So there's a lot of like the panels are all over the place. Like you'll have a full page splash and you'll have a page with like 2 panels in it to give lots of room for specific things. But then you have pages that are very specifically laid out with like 9 panels. And they're all kind of like, it's like a Tetris block, all kind of put together. You don't see a lot of that in modern comics. Like in modern comics, you see, I specifically remember reading one of the Astonishing X-Men issues, illustrated by John Cassaday and written by Joss Whedon. And every single page of that comic had either 4 or 5 panels. And they were all just widescreen blocks just going down. And while I'm not opposed to that entirely, I do think that that's incredibly boring from a layout standpoint because it doesn't stimulate your eye as you following the page. You're basically you could read. You don't have to read any of those panels on a page. You could just read all those panels individually on a website, just one panel, one panel, one panel, one panel, and you would get the story exactly the same, as opposed to if you read a page.
Okay.
And you can't do that with something like in Weapon X, like with what Barry Windsor-Smith does. So
I want to ask you about this though.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I kind of like rambled on there for a little bit. No, I didn't mean to.
You're okay. But now I'm really curious. So thinking about this as like Tetris blocks, I actually found some of the initial pages a little bit hard to follow. Like in reading them,
I was going to bring that up.
I thought for a second, like, I don't know if I'm going to like this book if it's all like this. And it actually changed.
Ironically enough, I had the same thing going on for me, too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not, like I said, it doesn't read like a regular modern comic book.
Right. Now, is that something, though, that Kirby would have done often? Because I don't know Kirby's work that well. Did he do the L blocks? Was that something he would have used often?
Not that I really remember. I think that's something that really kind of came out of the guys that were expanding off of Jack Kirby.
Okay. Because
Jack Kirby still kind of existed in that era of grid panels. And he used a lot of double page spreads. Like Kirby was basically, he'd have pages with grids and then pages with big spreads and then back to pages with grids, and he would kind of bounce around like that.
Okay.
And there wasn't quite as much like juggling on the page as you get with something like this with weapons.
Gotcha. I mean, for early in the story, it kind of works because it's sort of a dreamlike montage, like you're kind of trying to make sense of this weird thing that, as it turns out, gets weirder and his mind is scrambled, and it kind of makes sense. But in terms of just reading a page, I would read the words one way, and then I would kind of go back and read them a separate way, to make sure that I was grasping what was happening. It was interesting. It was very different.
There were a few pages that I think kind of stood out where it was initially kind of hard to tell which order you're supposed to read everything in, because like a traditional comic book page, the way you look at it is it should read like a V. Like you should read the top left corner, and then you should go right, and then you should kind of go down diagonally as you read the middle of the page, and then you should be at the bottom of the page and go right again. And this comic really breaks all those conventions. Specifically with the lettering. I do think that I was actually going to mention that to you. Did you notice anything weird about the lettering in this comic?
I noticed he put boxes in sort of a like start at the top left, and then he would go down and across and then back up.
Yeah, the lettering was different from traditional comics in that it would kind of like circle the panel.
Yeah. Okay.
So you'd have the focus of the panel, and the lettering would start on the left, and like you said, it would kind of go down and then go across the panel and then start to go up again, which is not something you see in a lot of regular comics, and I'm sure a lot of letterers would tell you that's not how you should do it.
I noticed that a lot in the scenes where right after he got kidnapped, he was in the liquid getting the transfusion, and I saw it said accelerated, blah, blah, and yeah. I saw it kept circling throughout the panel. It threw me off really bad at first, but then by the end of the book, I kind of got used to it.
Yeah, once you kind of get used to it, it's not that big of a deal.
I mean, it was very jarring initially, but it got comfortable near the end.
I do think that most of it is pretty well laid out, and that the lettering leads your eye. Like, I don't think it's that hard to follow. I just think a lot of times you're just used to reading comics a certain way, so that it just kind of goes against your instincts. But yeah, I did think that the lettering stood out in this comic, just kind of in the way it was placed around the panels.
Yeah,
and the way specific panels, the lettering would bounce back and forth. Like you would have, there's a specific page near the end. Let's see, it's chapter 11, page 1. Where it's like 3 vertical panels. It's where the professor throws Hines into the pit and as a trap for Logan, and Logan goes to kill her, and she starts begging for her life, and then he says that he's not going to kill her. He's not looking for her. That's an interesting lettered page because it's 3 vertical panels, but the lettering goes back and forth between all 3 panels. Like, you start off in one panel, then panel 1, then you go to panel 2, then you go back to panel 1. The lettering pulls you back to panel 1 to listen to what Hines is saying. And then you're back in panel 2, and then it takes you to panel 3 at the bottom of the page, and you read up to the right corner of panel 1. That, like I said, that is not how traditional comics are laid out.
Yeah.
But I do think that the way the art is laid out and the way it's lettering, it does sort of lead you along to it. So I don't think it's difficult to comprehend.
I think it takes some readjustment, but
exactly,
once you kind of learn the language he's working with, it starts to flow better as you move through
the thing
story.
that I thought was interesting too, while we're talking about that part specifically, lettering wise, whenever Logan starts talking for the first time, the text that they use for him actually looks more like handwritten than the rest of the text in the book. I thought that was just a nice, very, very subtle little thing. Like, it's hard to explain what.
Well, that's a lettering trick.
It was nice. I liked it
to help you as a reader understand that what he's saying. His voice is different than a regular person's voice.
Right. Especially now, he's been on a murderous rampage the whole book.
Yeah, so let's talk about the plot.
Okay.
It's a pretty straightforward plot. As we said, this story, Weapon X, sets itself up to be the origin of Wolverine, and it's sort of deceptive because it's not really Wolverine's origin, but it just gives you a glimpse into an important event of Wolverine's life, which is how he got the adamantium laced onto his bones. And I would say that the plot really simply is you have this organization called Experiment X. They don't really say who they are, what they're working for. It's in Canada somewhere. They kidnap Logan, who, let's see, at the beginning of the book, he is on mandatory leave from. They don't say who he's working for. I assume it's implied that he's either a soldier or some kind of cop or something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
So
yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Continue.
I was just couldn't remember exactly what it was, but I think it's implied that he's some kind of a soldier, and he accidentally shoots an innocent person. So he's kind of this. He's on leave. He's an alcoholic. They show him as somebody who's drinking a lot. And I particularly liked in the beginning this was a nice little plot element, which I think has since been undone by various retcons. But at the beginning, at the dossier, like Logan's dossier, they make mention of his his psychological profile, and in the dossier, they're talking about how he'd become increasingly obsessed about the mutant phenomenon, or like the mutant things. And I think the implication there is that Wolverine doesn't know he's a mutant. I think that's a major plot point in this story that has since been completely undone. Because there's some lines later on where the professor is talking about how they've like awakened Wolverine to his true self, and like now he knows he's a mutant, like he knows he's a monster essentially. So
I'm looking back at it now to just be sure. I sort of wondered if it was he knew something was different about himself, so he showed this. I think it's morbid preoccupation with the mutant scare.
Yes.
But whether he'd made anything of it, I don't know. I mean, he spends all his time drinking and kind of being a mess, so it leaves a lot of open questions.
It leaves it open, as we discussed. Like a lot of this stuff it gives you a really clear story of a specific event, but leaves so many questions unanswered. Because so we said Wolverine gets kidnapped by Experiment X. It's some weird experiment where they're just going to bond adamantium to a human for not much of a reason other than they're trying to create some kind of ultimate assassin living weapon. That's really
it was interesting though that they really never said like why they were doing that. Like you were saying, like they left a lot of unanswered questions, and now I'm sure Marvel's had a heyday with it, like you were saying. But
they've gone back to it multiple times.
Right. I mean, it's a masterpiece. Why wouldn't they?
But in the context of this story, the focus is really just a bunch of people working in Experiment X, and they kidnap Wolverine, and they send him through this process where he gets the adamantium laced to his bones, and then as a byproduct, and this is such a like an important thing that we'll probably talk about. For some reason, there's extra adamantium that accumulates in his arms, and they pop out in the form of these claws. And then he goes on a murderous rampage and starts killing everybody.
Right.
So, the whole claws thing, that of course is like one of the biggest talking points, because I seriously want to know. Actually, I don't need to know, because I'm pretty sure it's basically been confirmed that this was 1991 when they did the story about the claws, how he gets his claws, and then just a few years later, like 94, 95, they do the big story arc where Magneto rips the adamantium out of Wolverine, and it's revealed that his claws were actually bone.
Oh, so that happened after this story?
That happened after this story, right. And so the reveal, the retcon was that the adamantium process in Weapon X also laced the bones in his arms that the scientists didn't know were there. I mean, I guess it's a pretty okay retcon as far as retcons go.
It makes more sense than most of them.
Well, Windsor-Smith, I think, did a good job of kind of leaving it open.
Yeah.
Like, the whole mystery of, like, nobody really knew what was going on, why he had, like, why the extra metal showed up. It just did. It just accumulated his arms. And I think there was an implication with the professor talking to the mysterious voice that perhaps the mysterious voice was behind it all because he was making changes to the program and not telling anybody.
Right. Yeah, if I'm remembering right, there's some little things here that were sort of subtle. It was either the mysterious voice or the professor not telling everyone else that it was something that he wanted to have happen.
Exactly.
But it's interesting. I remember the cartoon, which was, I think,
the cartoon. They took a lot of those scenes from this.
They did.
Yeah, absolutely. They just changed all the soldiers to robots, so they
made it a little more PG.
Yeah.
Right. But I remember in the cartoon, there were. It's weird that I remember this from like first grade, second grade.
Yeah.
There were on his forearms there were like 3 rods that were like absorbed into his skin.
Yes.
implying that the claws were actually there. But that's not actually in the comic. In the comic, you just know that metal's being injected into him. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of
well, and they were very clear about, like, I actually really liked the part where they were confused by the claws showing up, and so they put the sutures into his wrist to, like, open, to, like, spread out the...
But then did the skin just heal around it?
Well, yeah, they put the sutures in so that it would create a path, so that the claws weren't, like, cutting through meat every time they came out.
Right.
Which, the whole point of that is because the claws are artificial. If they were natural, they would naturally have a path to, whatever. But
you would hope.
You would hope. I mean, I guess
there's all sorts of
mutants and
abnormalities, mutations, things that aren't supposed to happen in nature.
Right. But, you can make that argument, and that's a sound argument. I'm not saying it's wrong. I've just never been a fan of the plot twist of the bone claws. I just think that, just having him be a victim of the experiment and just giving him the claws is good enough. I don't like the, like, added continuity, but I guess that's I mean, when you get down to it, that's the nature of Marvel Comics for sure.
Right. So. But it's funny, like, just the ambiguity of the script kind of it lends itself to some of that. Like the fact that
Absolutely.
The professor says I think it's Dr. Cornelius says those knives, and he says, "Aren't you listening? They're claws."
Yeah.
Which doesn't necessarily say one way or the other, but it's interesting that it's sort of presented in a way that makes you raise an eyebrow. Like, why did he say it that way?
Yeah.
It seems very specific, not to just be, or it seems very intentional.
It's a deliberate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, that's, I don't know, that's the whole claws thing. The panel where they have the sutures in his wrist, where they're, like, doing the surgery on him, man, that creeped me out more than anything. Just, like, but I did also like that, because that was the explanation of why he has, like, the little metal things on his wrist where the claws come out.
Mm-hmm.
And that pretty much went away once they did the movies with Hugh Jackman, where they decided that the claws actually come out of, like, front of his fist, actually in between the knuckles instead of at the top of his hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so now Wolverine's not really depicted with, like, the three little metal dots. But right. I always liked those, but I guess
I did too. Part of it was just like, it was just a little subtle thing on his costume that just, I don't know, I liked it, but I also liked the reasoning behind it too. There was so many alarming scenes in this book of, like, him getting operated on and him getting, things stuck to him. There were so many times where I just, like, got shivers. I'm like, ugh, I'm so sick of seeing this. This is gross.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely brutal.
More brutal than I initially thought. The multiple scenes where they send him out into the wilderness outside of the compound to fight the various animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, the bears and the wolves and the so on. Like, after he fights the wolves, they're like, cancel that order. Just leave him out there.
Leave him outside.
And he's just sleeping on the corpse of wolves and stuff.
It's like I said, it's as a kid, like, I knew that this was different than regular comics. Like, I thought this wasn't something I was allowed to read.
As to why you tried to hide it.
Right.
Which I still think is hilarious, for the record.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I live a hilarious life.
I wouldn't say that.
I think part of that... Oh, go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I didn't read this when I was younger, but I think the first Wolverine comic I did read was Wolverine number 50, which had the claw slashes across the cover.
I got that issue, yeah. That's with Shiva. That's right. I think that issue... Those issues were, like, sold as, like, the tie-in to Weapon X.
Right. And I had a few other of the issues that sort of surrounded that. And even those, I remember... Gosh, it's been a while, but I remember as a little kid being sort of shocked by the, like, man, what happened to Wolverine was awful.
It was hardcore.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And this, I mean, you can see it was all borrowing imagery from this comic. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
There was multiple times where I just caught myself, like, feeling bad. I can't believe this. Obviously, you can't believe this is happening. and whatnot. But it's like, when they leave him out in the open after he mauls those wolves, it's like, really? He's naked, guys. Come on. Like, let him back inside. Give him a coat.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think one of the things about this comic, like we keep talking about how how gritty and eerie and off-putting and hardcore everything is. I think part of that comes from the fact that, as I said earlier, it's not a superhero comic. In fact, I mean, if anything, I would say that it's a horror comic.
There was multiple times of him, there was one time where he scratched his claws against the door. That my first instinct was like a psychological thriller.
Well, that's what it is. I mean,
Yeah.
Wolverine in this story, in Weapon X, Wolverine is not the protagonist. He's the antagonist.
Oh, yeah.
The protagonists are the Professor, Hines, and Cornelius.
Right.
And really what you have here is you have a classic horror or slasher film setup where it's an isolated facility. You have a bunch of people that are kind of trapped in there and they can't get out.
It's alien.
And you have this monster that's just running through killing everybody.
It's alien. Yeah.
Seemingly unstoppable.
Right.
Right.
And I mean that's what this book is. But it's just really weird because you know that the monster is Wolverine. Right. So you have this different sense of like sympathy for him, obviously. The same way that like they eventually, whenever they started doing like the stories of like Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, like their origins, like you had sympathy for them, but they were still like the monsters that were killing everybody. Mm-hmm. Whereas Wolverine, he's a hero. You know who Wolverine is. You want Wolverine to succeed. Mm-hmm. But, like he's the monster that's killing everybody. So it really kind of like spins the character around and puts him in a different light that he's normally presented. Right. He's always been presented as a character with an edge, but in this one he's straight up the bad guy. Although you could argue not consciously.
Right, and it's like you were saying, he's got that image. Like he's a good guy, but he'll still be the guy to make a smart ass remark or be smoking a cigar on the sidelines. But in this, it's
well, in this you don't even really have much of Wolverine's character in this.
Right.
And I think that's why
until like the end and the beginning part. Essentially,
yeah. I really love this comic, but I don't know if I could say it's my favorite Wolverine comic. I mean, it's one of my favorite Wolverine comics, but as far as like a comic that is about Wolverine, I don't know, because it's really not about Wolverine. It's about an event that happened to him, but it's really not much about his character.
Right.
Mm-hmm. It also has that weird sort of horror movie morality thing going on.
Yes.
Where the protagonists are, and you don't see this in all horror movies, but they're not necessarily great folks. They're questionable.
Well,
they're dabbling in something they maybe shouldn't be. I mean, whether that's like, if you compare it to cheesy movies from the 80s where you have teenagers that are messing around in the woods, or you compare it to like Dr. Frankenstein experimenting with, creating life from dead matter. Like it's a little bit like you probably,
it's a cautionary tale.
Right.
Yeah.
And ultimately they get, things go very poorly for them.
Frankenstein is a good example because it's, they created a monster and then, the monster struck back at them.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's it's also interesting you have, I mean, the professor is pretty much a despicable character.
He's the bad guy. Like,
right.
He's the real bad guy.
In terms of like his morals and his
obvious disregard for Wolverine or for Logan's health and all that thing.
Yeah.
Right. And human dignity and everything else.
A gigantic bucket list of terms.
Right. Absolutely. But then you have Cornelius and Hines, who are, you get the feeling they're a little better, but by the end of it, I don't really feel bad for anyone. Like they're slowly pulled in.
They're staggered levels. Like none of them are as bad as the professor, but like Cornelius is set up right at the beginning as being morally ambiguous. Mm-hmm. You get the little bit into his backstory by reading the newspaper clippings of the what was he, the assisted suicide doctor?
Right. Yes.
He was fleeing America because it was like the killer doctor or something like that. Which you can, I think you can argue that that's controversial, maybe he's not necessarily a bad guy, but they set him up as somebody who's had some conflict, like moral conflict. Mm-hmm. And Hines is really presented as the like naive conscience. She, first of all, she is the woman, so she is constantly like concerned about Wolverine's safety when nobody else is, like his comfort. She's concerned about his comfort. Mm-hmm. And but at the same time she's still there, and I don't think she just says she gets recruited to work there. Like,
yeah.
Right.
So because Cornelius specifically says like he was basically blackmailed into working there. But Hines is sort of like she's the tragedy element, mm-hmm. where like she's the innocent one. She's the innocent byproduct of everything. And which of course that's, they make a big deal about that too at the end. I guess, when we talk about like the twist on the simulation versus reality, but when Wolverine doesn't kill Hines, when he specifically doesn't kill her, mm-hmm. and then they're theorizing about whether or not the reason Wolverine doesn't kill Hines is because she wasn't a threat to him. And the professor says that he counts that as a weakness because they're trying to they're trying to create a killing machine, and the fact that he wouldn't just kill indiscriminately is a weakness. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about that, the whole reality versus
man. Yeah. I didn't even remotely I was so entranced in the fact that it turned into this horror film essentially that I completely forgot that was even a factor. Mm-hmm. And then it hits me, and I literally just was in awe. I completely forgot that it was even there, and it blew my mind.
Yeah,
you're totally pulled in.
Yes.
So if you've read the book, what happens. But basically what happens is throughout the course of the story, you're seeing Professor Cornelius and Hines. They're doing this experiment on Wolverine. They give him the adamantium, and then they begin giving him field tests to see, what he's capable of. So that, as we said before, they have him fight a bunch of wolves. He eventually fights a bear, and at some point after doing all these tests, he awakens from his programming, he's supposed to be knocked out, and he goes on a murderous rampage throughout the facility and kills everybody. He kills all the soldiers. He's trying to get to the professor. He kills Cornelius. The professor and Hines escape into, the nuclear reactor?
Yeah.
Yes, that they had there. And the professor throws Hines into the nuclear reactor as bait to lure Wolverine into the reactor so that he can blow it up and kill Wolverine, because that's the only way he's going to be able to kill Wolverine. Classic horror movie. You have to. There's only one way to kill the monster, and Wolverine doesn't fall for the trap because he doesn't kill Hines, and then he gets the reactor gets set off anyway, and Wolverine climbs out of it and cuts up the professor. And then there's these surreal pages of the characters still talking about Wolverine, and then Wolverine wakes up in the facility, and you basically find out that the whole murderous rampage was all a simulation, an implanted memory into Wolverine, because they were, I guess, trying to determine what he would do if he went on a murderous rampage and killed everybody, what he would do after that.
Because they hint to it earlier mm-hmm. in the book when they show what he's thinking on the screen, and it showed the doctor with the puncture wounds in his face. Yeah, right, which was neat foreshadowing, to this
hardcore panel.
Yeah, I mm-hmm. love that panel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's when they start. I guess because that's when the professor is talking about. That's when they kind of just that's the big reveal moment where they kind of explain everything that's going on. And the professor's upset because Wolverine in the simulation wouldn't kill Hines because Wolverine has to be an absolute killer. And then they send him off. He goes outside and he still has all of his murderous animal instincts, and he fights the mountain lion. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to bring him in, and then that's the way the comic ends. They're bringing him in, thoroughly satisfied with the way everything went. He still retained all of his instincts, even when they gave him the opportunity. He thought he was a free man, but he still fell into just this, murderous rage. So they're going to bring him in, and then he wakes up for real and tears through the facility, and the comic ends with him cutting through the door, and all three characters, Hines, Cornelius, and the Professor, cowering in fear of Wolverine ripping through the door.
Oh, so
and then and that's the end.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also also a horror film ending of just like ambiguous, like what really happened to the characters.
Right.
Did he kill them or did he kill them?
I love that ending. It bothered me a little bit that in the next page you have the bloodied, broken glasses of the professor.
The epilogue. I was a little surprised to see that epilogue, where they show the hand. It's specifically the hand with the blood. I wasn't sure.
Let's see. Is it the hand or? I think it's the glasses.
It is the glasses.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they show the glasses and the blood, and so you can assume that he did kill the professor.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that defeats the point of the ending being ambiguous.
Right. I wish. I don't know. They show the hand at the very last panel.
Oh, I see.
So they show both.
The beginning of the interlude, they show the glasses, and then they show the hand. Yes.
Right. They usually stop saying they. It's Barry Windsor-Smith, but
it is Barry Windsor-Smith.
I keep saying they. But
they show. He did everything.
He shows both of those, and I kind of wish it just ended on the the end.
Yeah,
I agree.
I don't know.
I mean, like with the glasses being there, like you already you know what happened essentially, and it just. I don't know. Just to reiterate, it feels like it defeats the point of the ending, the actual ending being ambiguous of what happened.
Mm-hmm. For me, the only reason I wasn't totally pulled into the twist early on is because I read some of the comics around it as a little kid, and I remember the Professor and Hines being characters. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of waiting the whole time, either to find out was this retcon later or what actually happens here. Mm-hmm. So that was I kind of didn't get the full experience of like how awesome the story is.
Yeah.
But
well, and that's kind of an interesting thing too. This comic set up what was the standard for like the Wolverine storytelling engine for a while, which was implanted memories.
Right.
So you had Wolverine as a character who he's really old. You don't know how old he is, and he's got all these weird memories of things that he doesn't know whether or not they're even real, because these people did experiments on him, and he's got all these weird memories. Some of them are fake, some of them are real. And I believe that all started in this. Mm-hmm. When they set up Experiment X, and with the whole simulation of him killing everybody, that eventually they just kept building on that and building on that. So they were able to kind of explain away any odd continuity that they didn't want anymore. They could just say like, "Oh, that was an implanted memory."
It's just more fake memories.
Just more fake memories. You don't know what you're doing with this character. Right. But they eventually did away with that. I think they got over the implanted memory stuff, which I thought was a pretty good like mechanic to use, like pretty good mechanism. Mm-hmm. For what the character is, just this ambiguously old. He's kind of like done everything, but the weathered hero kind of character. And having the implanted memories really kind of helped with the whole like troubled soul that Wolverine is.
Right.
Because like you were saying, it feels like he's done everything, but it doesn't really feel like he has much to show for it.
Right.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Which is, it's tragic. I feel bad for the guy.
Yeah. He's a tragic hero.
That's right.
So with the ending, I do agree that with the last panel, I think I would have preferred if it just ended with Wolverine walking out into the wilderness. And, even with that, you can get the implication is that he killed everybody, but with the last panel, just kind of that like final period of just like, yes, he did kill everybody.
Right.
It seems a little unnecessary.
Right. I think it would have been a little bit of mystery might have been more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well, as I understand it, the character of Cornelius has come back.
Right.
I don't know how many times, but so like, and of course, like, it's not like getting killed on the page in the panel expressly, being murdered has ever stopped anybody from coming back in comic books. So whatever.
Right. It's true. But in terms of just judging the work by
yes, exactly.
in
terms of
in and of itself,
the artistic merit of the story.
Right. You can always write a terrible miniseries, one shot, whatever, that retcons or changes something, but it's nice when an artist is given total control of a story, and you can read the story by itself and just recognize it as this is a really good story, and not have to worry about how it ties into everything else.
There's plenty of stories that I've read that I'm really glad that was the case. I won't get into them because there's a lot of other specific conversations, but it's great. A lot of them too, like with Shazam, I felt like that was really refreshing too. It was a self-contained story. It was great. I felt like the same with this for the most part, but then they went back to it.
It is a good self-contained, like, that's partially what I like about it, is it's a continuity point, but it's not a story that's like mired in continuity. It's something that you can read as a complete standalone.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even have to care about Wolverine or the X-Men to enjoy this.
Right.
Like I said, if you just like horror comics or psychological thrillers, this will do it for you.
There's just that extra layer of admiration when it's it's Wolverine, and so there's that.
And that's what I think makes it such a really good. At the time, it was a really good origin for Wolverine because, as we've kind of established, it's ambiguous where it needs to be ambiguous. It's not like it's not like trying to just like fill in continuity or just like throw out a lot of information to make it all fit in with things. The whole point of it is that it's ambiguous as to where it fits into his story, but it is an event that happened. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what helps it to stand alone as its own thing, but also be an important part of his history, the character's history. Yeah, so Alex, how would you say that this compares to like other X-Men comics?
Other X-Men comics. Well, the fact that it is a self-contained story, Barry Windsor-Smith's fingerprint is on the whole thing. Mm-hmm. It's very much like he wrote this, he drew this, he was very intentional in everything he was doing, and that's in my brain that's the dream. That's what a good comic should be.
Agreed.
And you get that occasionally in the X-Men, but generally you don't. So, as an X-Men story, I'd put this really high on the list.
Me too. Even though kind of like as I was saying, it doesn't really showcase the X-Men. I mean, it barely showcases Wolverine. But but the fact that it is a story about Wolverine that is like its own perfect masterpiece of a story. Like there's no like, it's not like a story from the ongoing series with like a fill-in issue in between and different artists here and there and a tie-in to another issue. It's so hard. People ask me all the time like what X-Men comics should I read? And it's really hard to kind of like recommend people like where to start or what they should read because honestly, I'm not super plugged into like current mainstream comics goings on. So I tell them they'd be better off going to a comic book store and asking them. They'll sell you anything you want. But like in terms of classic comics, really all I can say is just go read all the Chris Claremont and John Byrne, Dave Cockrum stuff. It all averages out to be pretty good, which is a huge undertaking because that's like 200 issues.
Right,
like,
it's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff.
Right.
There's some big ups and there's some big downs, but all averages out to be a pretty good comic. Whereas something like this, like Weapon X, I can say there's a graphic novel called Weapon X, and it's written and drawn by Barry Windsor-Smith, and it's a masterpiece, and you should read it. So that's partially why this is on my list of like really high up there, is how it compares to X, like in the terms of like quality X-Men comics.
Gotcha. I'm going to just totally discredit myself as an X-Men fan here. But have either of you guys read God Loves, Man Kills? And if so, how would you compare to this in terms of a self-contained story? And I say discredit because I have not actually read God Loves, Man Kills.
It's on my list.
To my shame. Okay.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but it's in the pipeline. I've wanted to read it when I found out what it was about. Because like I was saying, I'm recently getting into comics heavily, in gotcha. Part to this. Yeah, I have not read it personally, though.
Gotcha. I'm trying to remember which one God Loves, Man Kills is. That's the one with...
It's the one with Reverend Stryker. I mean, it was a lot of the inspiration for some of the movies.
The movie, yeah.
X2. I mean, not directly, but sort of. It's one like...
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
It's one that I hear mentioned a lot as like, well, it's a fairly self-contained, great X-Men story that addresses a lot of the themes that are central to the X-Men. But again, I kind of started in the 90s, and then I've gone back to find older things. And,
right. Well, that's the same with me. I started in the 90s and have gone back. Right. I actually haven't read God Loves, Man Kills. Again, like you, I'm discrediting myself here as an X-Men fan. I need to read it. It's on. Maybe we'll do it for a future podcast.
How about that? I was about to.
We should have a follow up.
We'll follow up. Well, that's what we'll do. We'll do a follow up to Weapon X. We'll read God Loves, Man Kills for a future episode of Comic DNA. And Alex,
that's a great idea.
You will be on that podcast.
All right.
Or else.
All right. And then I can compare it to all of the 90s and Grant Morrison and go from there.
Yes. So, I think that pretty much sums up Weapon X. I mean, we all liked it, right?
Oh, I adored it.
Absolutely.
So, I'm going to go get my own copy now.
It's a definite recommend.
Most things on this are recommended.
Well, that's how we want to do things around here. Yeah. But for all the things we just said over the last hour, that's why this book is a good book.
I mean, frankly, if nothing else, if you want to see a comic that is more or less unlike anything you've ever read, even especially in X-Men continuity, pick it up. It's very refreshing. For being so graphic, it's very refreshing.
Yeah, and kind of like... Oh, go ahead, Alex.
It's really cool in that the simplicity of the story makes it feel very decompressed, which was... has become a much bigger thing in the last 15 years in comics. But the density of the art doesn't make it feel decompressed at all. It's a simple story that's very rich.
Yeah. That's something that I was going to kind of say. I was going to talk about, again, when I was talking about how it's like old style versus modern style. This definitely has that, like you said, the density of the pages. You have a lot of panel-to-panel storytelling, or I should say it's not panel-to-panel storytelling. You have a lot of these panels which are disconnected. They don't each panel does not directly flow into the next panel, but the text boxes do. So what you're having is you have a lot of these abstract images of the events as they are happening through different lengths of time. It's not just like different lengths of time and space.
Right.
So it's not just characters in the same room talking. You're bouncing around from inside, outside, forwards, and backwards. But the linear story is being told through the character's conversation, which is being had in the text over top all of the images. And I was thinking about how different that is from a lot of modern comic book artists and writers, particularly, what Marvel is putting out right now. Not to pick on him or anything, but if this story were done by Brian Michael Bendis, all of the pages would just be headshots of Cornelius Hines and the Professor, with 8 to 9 panels and then a couple of full-page splashes of each little dialogue box in each panel of the characters like, reacting to each other. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that stylistically that's very different than what you're getting in Weapon X.
Absolutely. It makes your brain work a little more to sort of move through the pictures and the words. But in a good way, I think.
I think so.
Oh, yeah, in a very good way.
I was reading, like I said, I'm a big fan of Barry Windsor-Smith, and I've read a few interviews by him, and he talks very passionately about, specifically during this period of time when he was making comics, he talks very passionately about not talking down to the audience. He talks very passionately about how comics can reach a higher level of art, and you don't need to hold the reader's hand. And if the reader didn't understand it the first time, they can go back and read it a second time for free because they already paid for it.
What a great outlook.
Which I thought was
awesome.
Yeah.
That's so respectable.
Yeah, so like I said, Barry Windsor-Smith, he is a master. He doesn't pull any punches, and he doesn't talk down to the audience. And in fact, I would say that he gives you a comic that really challenges you, which
I think so.
People do, yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think so.
In that way, it's a lot more like like an indie art film or something. It's taking its time to make you think about exactly what the camera is showing.
And then once you figure it out, it's revelation. You're just blown away.
Or I would say like a Kubrick film, where every little thing he does is deliberate, and as you said, it forces you to kind of, I guess when I'm reading Weapon X, or like when I'm watching a Kubrick film, when I see something that I don't understand, I try to understand why it was done. I don't just automatically assume that it was a mistake, like I would do with a lot of other modern comic book creators. Which is, it's not to say that I do that all the time, but there are times when you're reading a comic book where you just kind of get used to just being like, oh, that's just bad writing, or that's just...
Which is really unfortunate that has come to that, but it happens.
Well, I mean, that's like that in everything.
Right.
With a comic like this, which I do believe is on such a level that I don't think there are anything that doesn't make sense, it's not because it's a mistake. It's because it's done in a deliberate way to challenge you. Which is pretty high and mighty of me to say, pretty pretentious. I don't know. That's just the way I am, I guess. I get used to it.
Unfortunately, we're already used to it.
No worries. Keeps it interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that about does it for this episode of Comic DNA.
Right.
Alex, I want to thank you for doing the podcast with us. I was glad to get your insight into not just as an X-Men fan, but as an artist. I thought you would have an appreciation of Barry Windsor-Smith.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And thank you for having me, both of you. It's been fun.
It's been good. Kind of let us do something a little different with our podcast. So that about does it for Weapon X by Barry Windsor-Smith. Thanks to everybody who's been listening to our podcast. We've got the podcast up every other Wednesday on comicdna.podbean.com. That is the new home, or that is the home of the podcast. And you'll also be able to find updates on newhavencomics.com. Every time I put it up on the Podbean, I put it up on New Haven Comics. And you can also get updates on Facebook. We're on Facebook, New Haven Comics on Facebook. You can find me personally on Facebook. I'm Aaron Walther. You can also find me on Twitter at AAWALTHER. And again, thanks everybody for listening. Next week, Luke, I think we talked about we're going to do a comic that's quite a bit different than what we've done lately, but still kind of dark, the way Weapon X was dark.
I believe, yes, we're doing My Friend Dahmer, correct?
That's correct. We're going to do My Friend Dahmer by Durf. Durf Back Durf. This is our first non-fiction comic for the episode, for the podcast, so I'm pretty excited. I'm a big fan of Durf, and I'm a big fan of My Friend Dahmer, because it's a fascinating look into the lives of not only high school teenagers, but also a high school teenager who went on to become the serial killer known as Jeffrey Dahmer. So, it should be a good book. I think, Luke, you'll really like it.
I'm really excited because you've been talking it up quite a lot.
I mean,
rightfully so.
I think that's going to be a running theme. I kind of talk up everything that I'm excited about.
I mean, as it should be. It's nice to hear someone finally excited about something.
Yes. So, yeah, come back in 2 weeks, and Luke and I will have read, and we will be talking about My Friend Dahmer by Dirtback Durf. Thanks a lot, everybody, for listening. We'll see you next time.